Hey, hey y'all, I'm back. We're gonna get back into this book. We're reading The View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith. Okay, so number 6. This author says, soon after the feast of the Passover in various parts of the country, before the setting of the sun, chariots and armed men were seen in the air passing round about Jerusalem. This strange sight occurring before sunset and being seen in various parts of the country must have been a miraculous portent, a sign from heaven. The Jews had said, "What sign showest thou that we may see and believe?" Now they had their sign in abundance, yet they would not believe. Wow. I was reading that again. My bad. The last and most fearful sign Josephus relates that one Jesus, son of Ananias, a rustic of the lower class, appeared in the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles, and suddenly exclaimed, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the temple, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against the whole people. These words he continued to exclaim through the streets of Jerusalem by day and by night, with no cessation, unless what was needed for the support of nature. For 7 years he commenced in the year 63, while the city was in peace and prosperity, and terminated his exclamation only in his death, amidst the horrors of the siege in the year 70, and terminated his exclamation only in his death, amidst the horrors of the siege in the year 70. This strange thing, when it commenced, soon excited great attention, and thus Jesus was brought before Albinus, the Roman governor, who interrogated him, but could obtain no answer except the continuation of his woes. He commanded him to be scourged, but to no effect. During times of festivals, this cry of his was peculiarly loud and urgent. After the commencement of the siege, he ascended the walls, and in a voice still more tremendous than ever, he exclaimed, "Woe, woe to this city, this temple, and this people!" And he then added for the first time for these 7 years, "Woe, woe to myself." The words were no sooner uttered than a stone from a Roman machine without the walls struck him dead on the spot. Such were the signs in the heavens and in the earth which just preceded the destruction of Jerusalem. Several of them are recorded by Tacitus as well as by Josephus. The veracity of Josephus as a historian is probably allowed by all. Scaliger affirms that he deserved more credit as a writer than all the Greek and Roman historians put together. From the conquest of Jerusalem by Pompey 60 years before Christ, the Jews repeatedly had exhibited a most rebellious spirit against the Romans. The Jews had basically said to Pilate concerning Christ, "If thou let this man go, thou art not a friend of Caesar." But the fact was they persecuted Christ because he would not erect a temporal throne in opposition to Caesar. Any impostor who seemed prepared to do this, they were ready to follow, and were ready to improve every apparent occasion to evince their decided hostility to the Romans, and they barely needed a prophet's eye to discern that this spirit and conduct manifest on all occasions would soon draw against them the Roman sword. Judas, a Gaulonite, and Sudok, a Pharisee, had rallied the Jews with the idea that their paying tribute to the Romans would not fail to confirm them in the most abject slavery, in consequence of which their enmity often burst forth with malignant violence. Tumults and riots increased and flourished. The Roman governor of Judea, by his cruel exactions, increased this spirit among the Jews. Eleazar, son of the high priest, persuaded the officers of the temple to reject the offerings of foreigners and to withhold public prayers for them. The Roman government felt the insult, and a basis was soon found to be laid for a Roman war. Feuds and contentions increased in Judea, till Caesius Gallus marched an army thither from Syria to restore order. His march was marked with blood and desolation. The city of Zebulun, Joppa, and other villages in his way he plundered and burned. 8,400 of the inhabitants of the former place he slew. The district of Narbatene he laid waste, and slew 2,000 of the Jews in Galilee, reduced the city of Lydda to ashes, and drove the Jews who made desperate sallies upon him till he encamped within 100 miles of the capital. Soon after he entered Jerusalem and burned some part of the city, but through the treachery of his own officers he made an unexpected flight. The enraged Jews pursued him and slew about 60,000 of his men. Many of the rich Jews, alarmed at the Roman invasion, fled from Jerusalem and from a floundering ship. Some suppose many of the Christians now fled to a place called Pella in the mountains of Judea. Nero, being informed of the defeat of Cestius, gave the command to Vespasian to press the war against the rebellious Jews. He and his son Titus soon collected an army of 60,000 men. In AD 67, he marched from Ptolemais to Judea, marking his steps with ravages and desolation. Infancy and age fell before the furious soldiery. All the strong towns of Galilee and many of those of Judea fell before the victorious arms of Vespasian, who slew not less than 150,000 inhabitants. Signal vengeance was taken on Joppa, which had in part been rebuilt after it had been by Cestius reduced to ashes. Vespasian was enraged. Y'all, let me get some water. I'm stumbling. Okay. Vespasian was enraged at the frequent piracies of this people. The Jews of this place, fleeing before him, betook themselves to their shipping. But a furious tempest overlooked those who stood out to sea, who were lost. The others were dashed vessel against vessel, or against the rocks. Some in their distress laid violent hands on themselves. 9. Such as reached the shore were slain by the enraged Romans. The sea for some distance was stained with their blood. 4,200 were strewed along their coast, and not one escaped to relate their catastrophe. Truly this was distress of their nation, with the sea and the waves thereof roaring. Vespasian returned from Jericho to Caesarea to prepare for a grand siege of Jerusalem. Here he received intelligence of the death of the Emperor Nero. This led him to suspend for the present the execution of his plan against the Jews. This respite 2. That devoted people continue about 2 years, but encourage them to deeds of greater enormity. A spirit of faction now appeared in Jerusalem. 2 parties first, and afterwards 3 raged there, each contending with deadly animosity for the presidency. A part of one of these factions, having been excluded from the city, entered it by force during the night, and to such madness were they abandoned that they butchered on that fatal night not less than 8,500 of men, women, and children, whose mangled bodies appeared the next morning strewed in the streets of Jerusalem. These abandoned murderers plundered in the city, murdered the high priest, Ananias, and Jesus, and insulted their dead bodies. They slew their brethren of Jerusalem as though they had been wild animals. They scourged and imprisoned the nobles in hopes to terrify them to become of their party, and many who could not be thus won they slew. In this reign of terror, 12,000 of higher orders of the people thus perished, and no relative dared to shed a mourning tear, lest it should bring on him a similar fate. Accusation and death became the most common event. Many fled but were intercepted and slain. Piles of their carcasses lay on public roads, and all pity as well as regard for human or divine authority seemed extinguished. To add the horrid calamities of the times occasioned by the bloody factions, Judea was infested by bands of robbers and murderers, plundering their towns and cutting in pieces such as made any resistance, whether men, women, or children. Here were exhibited the most horrid pictures of what fallen man is capable of perpetrating when restraints are taken off. That they would turn their own towns and societies into scenes of horror like kennels of mad animals. One Simon became commander of one of these factions, John of another. Simon entered Jerusalem at the head of 40,000 banditti. A third faction arose, and discord blazed with terrific fury. These 3 factions were intoxicated with rage and desperation, and went on slaying and trampling on piles of the dead with an indescribable fury. People coming to the temple to worship were murdered, both natives and foreigners. Their bodies lay in piles, and a collection of blood defiled the sacred court. John of Gishalah, head of faction, burned a store of provisions. Simon, at the head of another faction, burned another. Thus the Jews were weakening and destroying themselves, and preparing the way for wrath to come upon them to the uttermost. In the midst of these dismal events, an alarm was made that a Roman army was approaching the city. Vespasian, becoming emperor and learning the factious and horrid state of the Jews, determined to prosecute the war against them, and sent his son Titus to reduce Jerusalem and Judea. The Jews, on hearing of the approach of the Roman army, were petrified with horror. They could have no hope of peace. They had no means of flight. They had no time for counsel. They had no confidence in each other. What could be done? Several things they possessed in abundance. They had a measure of iniquity filled up, a full ripeness for destruction. All seemed wild, disorder, and despair. Nothing could be imagined but the confused noise of the warriors, and garments rolled in blood. They knew nothing was their due from the Romans but exemplary vengeance. The ceaseless cry of combatants and the horror of faction has indeed come to desire the intervention of a foreign foe to give them deliverance from their domestic horror. Such was the state of Jerusalem when Titus appeared before it with a besieging army. but he came not to deliver it from its